Hello and welcome to this lecture about properly citing your sources in my Speech 1113 class. We have a number of folks listed here in the title slide. Some of these folks are Dr. Andrew Weil, Benjamin Franklin, and Anne Frank. We have a title listed here, and that's the New York Times. We have some dates, September 11th, 2001, and December the 7th, 1941. That's because those are three of the four components that you need to make sure that you include to properly cite your sources orally during your speeches in my class. Let's talk about all four of the things that you need to do to properly cite your sources. You'll need to share four pieces of information with us. You're going to want to share the author. That's the person who's expressing the opinion that you are citing. Who wrote this? Next is the qualification, credibility statement for the person whose evidence you are citing. Why should we believe them? Next, date, time frame for which the evidence was applicable. When was this information published? And then finally a publication, and that's a specific source of the information. In what publication was this information published? Let's talk about each of those four in a little bit more detail. First is the author. That's a person expressing the opinion that you're citing. Who wrote this? Was it Anne Frank, Michael Bouchard, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Friedman, Sonia Sotomayor, Danielle Steele, George Bernard Shaw, or Dr. Andrew Weil? Any one of those are famous authors and would be appropriate people for you to potentially cite in a speech in my class. As a result of that, one of the first things that you need to share about your information is the author, the person who wrote that information. Next, tell us why your author is qualified. Give us a brief credibility statement for the person whose evidence you're citing. Why should we believe them? If you'll remember back to our discussions about credibility, credibility is made of your competence, character, and charisma. Here we're going to focus mostly on competence. Give us some credentials for the person that you are citing. In other words, tell us why they are qualified for us to pay attention to their opinion on this particular topic. As you remember from our discussion about credibility, credentials usually have to deal with experience, with education, and with expertise. For instance, if I was giving a speech about human rights violations or about the Holocaust or about forgiveness, I might talk about Anne Frank, who was a Holocaust victim and an internationally renowned author. I might discuss Michael Bouchard, an assistant director of field operations for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, if I was talking about something that dealt with the illegal distribution of guns or alcohol counterfeiting, or something of that nature, something that had to do with a law enforcement topic. If I was talking about the founding of our nation, or in general just discussing some philosophy, or maybe you needed a good attention getter, Benjamin Franklin is a great resource to cite. Thomas Friedman is a thinker and a New York Times columnist, and he writes from a conservative point of view about a number of different topics. Sonia Sotomayor is a recently confirmed U.S. Supreme Court Justice, and she has written very extensively about a lot of legal issues. You could cite her in a speech that had to do with legal issues. Next is Danielle Steele, and she's of course a famous novelist. Many of you have read some of her books. George Bernard Shaw is a philosopher, thinker, and playwright, and a person who wrote a lot of plays around the late 1800s and early 1900s. And then finally, Dr. Andrew Weil, who is a famous wellness doctor and a nutritionist. And he writes a lot about holistic medicine and about utilizing alternative forms of healing through medicine and through a more healthy lifestyle, including exercise. So you've discussed your author's qualifications, you've named your author. Next you need to tell us what date that information was published in. This is important because there are large punctuating events. One of those large punctuating events was something that was discussed in the title slide, and that was the attacks of September 11, 2001. Those attacks changed a lot of information, and it changed a lot of mindsets regarding the consumption of information. For instance, if I had a piece of information that said that the next terrorist attack on the United States of America would undoubtedly be a terrorist attack that included chemical, nuclear, or biological weapons, I would want to make sure that my information wasn't just information that had been from before 2001, but that I included something, that happened after that. In other words, the terrorist attacks of 2001 invalidated that earlier piece of information. So you don't want your audience to be sitting there thinking, well, who wrote that, or what were their qualifications, or what date was that published. You want to remove any possibility from the audience's mind that might be kind of a seed of doubt that would get sown as to the validity of your information. So tell the author these 4 things and you should be able to accomplish that. So you shared your author, you talked about their qualifications, you discussed the date. The last thing that you're going to want to do is share with us the specific source of the information. In what publication was the information published? Publication is where the information was published. So it might be the Diary of Anne Frank, it might be in the New York Times, it might be the Wall Street Journal, it might be in a novel called The Southern Lights, it might be in a play called Pygmalion, it might be in a book called Natural Health, Natural Medicine. Some examples, and we have here the author listed in black. We have the qualification of the individual listed in blue. We have the source of the publication listed there in green, and we have the date that it was published in red. So the speaker of this particular source citation in the actual speech in my class would say something to the effect of Anne Frank, a Holocaust victim and internationally renowned author, noted in the Diary of Anne Frank, first published in 1947. Or you might say something to the effect of Michael Bouchard, the Assistant Director of Field Operations for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, stated in a June 15, 2002 interview in Esquire magazine. Or Benjamin Franklin, philosopher, politician, and founding father of our country, stated in the 1764 Poor Richard's Almanac. Another couple of examples, Thomas Friedman, a thinker and New York Times columnist, in his 2007 book, Hot, Flat, and Crowded, Why America Needs a Green Revolution, observed. According to George Bernard Shaw, philosopher, thinker, and playwright, in his book Pygmalion in 1912, Andrew Weil, famous wellness doctor and nutritionist, in his text, The Natural Health, Natural Medicine, first published in October 2003, stated the following. So that's an example of the short, brief ways that you would cite sources for your speeches in my class. You can typically work most of this information in an average-sized sentence, and there's really no reason to become intimidated or freaked out about the oral citation of sources in these speeches. Remember, it's much better to have an objective standard than a subjective standard. As such, I've created this objective standard to protect you and to make sure that you get all the points that you deserve in your speeches. And if you'll simply do those 4 things and relay those 4 pieces of information to the audience will not be sitting there thinking the whole time, yeah, well, where did they get that piece of information? And the reason they won't be doing that is because you will have shared your author, that author's qualifications, the date that information was published, and the publication that information was published in. If you'll share those 4 pieces of information, you'll do well in your speeches, both in this class and after you graduate and after you leave our class. Thank you very much, and I hope that you learned about how to properly cite your sources in this narrated PowerPoint. Good luck.